Good evening, everyone. We have a few housekeeping items to share to ensure that tonight's meeting is a successful one. During this meeting, we will provide information that is specific to and focuses on ATL Zoning 2.0 and the process. We have set aside opportunities for participants to ask questions to our speakers following each presentation. During the Q&A session, please ask one question at a time to allow all questions to be recognized and answered. As you'll notice, everyone is muted. Please use the raise your hand icon in the lower toolbar to request to be unmuted for your question. Speakers will be called in the order in which the hand raised icons are lifted. If you are joining the meeting via telephone, please press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute when your phone number is called. You may also post questions in the chat as we will be answering questions from that feature. Additionally, if you are watching live via YouTube, please post your questions in the YouTube chat. If you're watching the Idea Labs at a viewing party, please share your questions with the facilitator. Tonight, we have 3 viewing parties joining in: the Atlanta Realtor Association, the West End CID, and Reemerge. For any unanswered general questions asked tonight, we will make every effort to answer on the project website's frequently asked questions page. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kieta Holmes, and I'm the Director of the Office of Zoning and Development in the Department of City Planning. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Idea Lab, the fourth in a series. We have presented to you several different ideas, and tonight will culminate with ideas related to coding in place and residual developments. With that, I'll turn it over to Caleb for us to get started.
Great. Good evening, everyone. My name is Caleb Rossico. I am project manager for the Atlanta Zoning Rewrite Consulting team. And I thank you very much for joining us this evening. If we could go to the next slide, please, and the following one, actually. Tonight is the final in a series of 4 Idea Labs that we've been putting together to really encourage conversation and awareness on various issues related to zoning and development as we embark on this multi-year process to rewrite the City of Atlanta zoning ordinance. In many ways, these Idea Labs have been intended to build upon each other, starting with a series of labs that looked at understanding the existing patterns in Atlanta through conversations about sustainability and urban ecology, and then even conversations about transportation and how we've learned as a city from COVID-19. And tonight's session is really focused on issues of neighborhood character, city character, and really the sense of physical attributes of what makes Atlanta, Atlanta. We have 2 very exciting sessions this evening. The first one will be Lee Einsweiler with Code Studio, who's going to talk to us about what are some ways that Atlanta might be able to update the zoning code to better preserve local place. And that means neighborhoods, that means districts, that means really all of the things that physically make Atlanta special. And then after that, Pavan Iyer of 8 Village Architects will be presenting another bit of information on how can we make better use of the spaces within our city. He's going to present a series of concepts really related to unlocking residual or leftover space in the city. Each of these sessions will be followed by a Q&A. And then, of course, as with previously, there will be a series of polling questions. Next. And as always, this session is going to be recorded and posted to the project website, which is www.atlzoning.com. We've also set up a hotline if anyone is interested in calling with any follow-up questions or comments or other concerns. That's 404-546-0116. And then, of course, you can always reach out to us at the project email, atlzoning2@atlantaga.gov. And we do appreciate everyone who has emailed us there or left messages on the hotline to date. They've been very helpful. And then finally, as was spoken before, all of these are being recorded on the project website and on YouTube. If you would like to look on the website, They're under the participate page. And if you would like to find them on YouTube, just search for the Atlanta Department of City Planning for access. And then finally, I did want to mention that we have put the questions that were asked from the previous 3 Idea Labs on the project website. They're actually underneath the individual presentation for the previous session. So when you go to the website, pull up the actual archive for the particular meeting, and then there you can see any of the questions that people had that we were unable to answer during the session. As Paula Owens mentioned, we are also going to take some of the more universal questions, and we'll be regularly updating the frequently asked questions part of the website. Okay, next. And then finally, as with our previous sessions, we have structured this so that there will be a series of polls as we go through the process. For those of you who are watching on Zoom, it will be like it was before. There will just be a little survey that will pop up and you'll be able to answer the question there. But for those of you who are joining us at one of the 3 Idea Labs this evening, we'd like to make sure that you are also able to participate. So we ask you to please pull out your smartphone or iPad or other internet capable device and go to the website menti.com. That's MENTI.com. And there you'll be queued for a code. Please enter the code 24921517. And just keep this page open for the duration of the presentations. And as we get to the surveys, they will pop up on Zoom, and then they'll also pop up on there for folks who don't have access to Zoom. So again, menti.com, 24921517. Next. And just to make sure that everything is working for everyone, especially those at the viewing party, we did want to do a sample question. So if we could advance, Yinka. We'd like to ask you, how did you learn about the Idea Labs this evening? Was it by e-blast, social media, yard sign, press release, word of mouth, or other? And again, if you're doing it via Zoom, you can just click the appropriate answer on your phone or on your computer. If you are at a viewing party, go to menti.com and enter there. And it looks like we've got quite a few folks who are doing it at the viewing party, many by other and word of mouth. And the same seems to be going online. So it looks like everyone is familiar with how the process works. So again, just keep that page open. Don't log out because we'll be updating it regularly as we go through the process. So with that said, I would like to go to the next slide and begin the introduction to one of our 2 speakers this evening. Yinka? Okay. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Lee Einsweiler with Code Studio to talk to you about what I think is going to be a very interesting, exciting way that we can perhaps hopefully think about updating the zoning code to better achieve some of the ideas that you've shared with us today. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Lee. Thank you.
Thank you, Caleb. So tonight's session we've called Coding for Place. It's a discussion about how to use zoning in placemaking. Next slide, please. I want to introduce Code Studio, our firm, first. Our firm was founded 15 years ago. Colin Scarf and I started the firm in order to more effectively implement some of the planning and zoning work that we were doing. We work on plans and codes focused on vibrant, mixed-use, walkable communities. We believe heavily in creative infill and redevelopment. We're a leader in working on major city codes. If you ask around, we're working right now in Los Angeles, Detroit, Cleveland, and now in Atlanta. Previously, we'd worked on the Denver Code, the Raleigh Code, and a few others. We believe that we bring a unique approach to each city, and we're eager to bring that skill set to Atlanta. Next slide, please. So some of our client cities that I mentioned, also some of our smaller projects, which are much more focused on place, 5 downtown neighborhoods in Chattanooga, the River Arts District in Asheville, and some transit-oriented development areas in Milwaukee as some additional examples. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to sort of frame the challenge of coding for place. We're going to explore some ideas for how places can be coded. And then we're going to show a little bit about how those ideas might be applied in a place like Atlanta. Next slide. So the toughest question is, why does Atlanta need a new zoning ordinance? Well, it's been a long time since you've had a full rewrite. That's fairly common for large cities. But the fact of the matter is there are lots of places in the city where the zoning doesn't fit correctly now. And you're using lots of other tools to sort of patch your existing ordinance. And an overall rewrite seems to be the right route for you at this point in time, especially as you begin to think about implementing Atlanta city design and other recent plans. Next slide. So recently, you've adopted Atlanta city design and Plan A, and those set a vision for the city. This project, Atlanta Zoning 2.0, is all about providing one of the most significant tools for implementing those plans. Next slide. The fact of the matter is that early work conducted by this team, including UTIL out of Boston, who presented one of the first idea labs, shows that the existing zoning ordinance does not have the tools to implement the Atlanta City Design Plan A or other adopted neighborhood plans even, especially if you want to respect Atlanta's existing neighborhood patterns. That analysis is worth looking at sometime if you're interested in the issues. There are lots of issues of nonconformities that were created by applying zoning over the top of older neighborhoods from prior to zoning. There are also many issues created simply because the wrong tools are being applied in the wrong places. Next slide, please. So one of the challenges is that in some of the very beloved parts of the city, the image on the left is in Peachtree Hills, the one in the center in the West End, the one on the right-hand side in Reynoldstown. These kinds of things are not possible anymore. So the R4 zoning in the left-hand image generated non-conforming lots and setbacks for existing places. This missing middle in the center image, a multiplex in the West End, is also not legal today according to zoning. So, and in the right, a shopfront has been converted back to a single family house because it's not allowed to be used as a shopfront anymore. And so some of these challenges could be resolved through the application of a new code. Next slide, please. Right now, these kinds of neighborhood servicing buildings and businesses are actually at risk of being lost, whether taken over by uses that are not appropriate for their original construction as commercial buildings, or otherwise being found illegal. And if they are closed or abandoned for a certain period of time, then the use is lost and is not to be recaptured. So if we want to hang on to these beloved places, we need to begin thinking about our zoning in these neighborhoods a little bit differently. Next slide, please. So one of the other challenges is that new development, which actually conforms to the code, is substantially out of character with the existing neighborhoods. And so on the left-hand side, you'll see in Edgewood, a set of two homes next to a historic home. One of those two homes is more appropriately scaled than the other. On the right-hand side of the screen, that's the old Fourth Ward. You've got a front-facing garage on a block that doesn't have any, and a massive structure that is out of keeping with its modest neighbors. So if we really intend to keep some of the current character in our neighborhoods, we're going to have to change their zoning. Next slide. So Here's the big book today, the 1982 ordinance as amended, and a little picture of the 1929 code that was in place when many of the things we were just looking at might have originally been constructed. The 1929 code was a much, much, much simpler code. And we can aspire to a simpler code again if we're regulating the right things. And that's what this whole discussion is about. Next slide, please. So really, we want to ask the question, how do we create that set of tools that will support Atlanta's vision for the future? Next slide, please. First and foremost, we need a clear, user-friendly code. So what you see on the left are some pages, admittedly with illustrations, at least a step up from a typical zoning ordinance in some older codes. But on the right-hand side is some of our work in one of our other client cities. You'll see in the background there a two-dimensional site graphic that links the summary tables to the graphic images with little circles and letters, allows people to understand exactly where the rules apply. Shifting gears into the page in the front, you'll see that we use three-dimensional imagery for the massing and actually somewhat realistic building types to show elements like windows and doors when they are added. So all in all, a much clearer code that speaks more directly to how these rules apply. Next slide. So really what we're looking for is a predictable code, one in which what you see in the code is actually what you get, rather than paragraphs of text which show us nothing about the form or character of the future growth. Next slide. One other important element is being sure that we streamline the process. If we think we have challenges associated with affordable housing today, as processes get more and more awkward and the code gets patched more and more times, it will simply get more complicated. The process on the far left is a very simple process, as you can tell from the flow chart. If we can stay in that process with new rules, it will be much swifter to develop new zoning, to develop new projects under the new zoning, and we'll be able to build what neighborhoods are choosing to have occur in their neighborhood. The two tools in the middle and on the right are a zoning code amendment and a variance. We'd like to avoid using so much of those in the future. And so the creation of SBIs and other special tools are only occurring because the code has been so long since it's been updated. Next slide, please. So here you see an example of today's code, the R5 district, which is a two-family residential district. On the left-hand side are the things that vary for R5, the lot requirements, yards, height, sidewalk requirements, the relationship of the building to the street, the uses, and the parking requirements. But those are all bundled together in a single package called R5. And then they are supplemented by the piece on the right, the general and supplemental regulations that apply across all districts. Next slide, please. So a possible way to begin to think about this is to kind of tease apart all of the sections of what the existing district is doing today. So the lot and yard requirements on the height refer to the form, the general form of development. The sidewalk requirements in relationship to the street might be considered the frontage of that particular project. The use is clearly the use. And we often use the term site to talk about requirements like parking, landscaping, and lighting, which may vary. Again, there will be citywide development standards in any new code, but this tool might be used to vary some of the elements so that we have more versions of R5 rather than just one bundled version. Next slide, please. One way to think about this is to say that form would regulate the building scale and the setbacks. The frontage might regulate how the building relates to the public realm, meaning the space between the building and the street. The site regulations would regulate site elements of design like signs, landscaping, parking, and access. And finally, not to be forgotten, even though we are talking more heavily about regulating form, use is still a very important part of what we would be regulating. And that is regulating the activities that might be occurring on the lot, whether as allowed uses, subject to standards, perhaps even limiting the number of units allowed on a lot. Many of those kinds of elements could be used. And no matter what, this code will end up being a hybrid of some sort, regulating use in the future, even as it has been regulated today, while also considering perhaps regulating more elements of form a little bit more carefully. Next slide, please. So if we took this new approach to districts, we would first explore and define the context in the city according to a planning process. And some of that has been done already as part of Atlanta city design and other planning. And so the context really is setting street, alley, and block patterns, building placement and height, the diversity and intensity of land uses, and the options for mobility that are available to people. All of those that come together, those existing facts about a neighborhood, can describe the development pattern. And then zoning tools can be built in response to those contexts by using form, frontage, site, and uses that relate directly to that context. Next slide. As an example, we've teased apart this R5 district, and we might be saying something like form might be house scale number 3. Frontage might be neighborhood frontage with a side drive, which might be called N2. And we might be using the site standards package called Set A, and we might be applying the residential use package number 2. So now we have 4 elements here that all make up the built environment and the activity in the built environment that we can turn as dials and dial up and down the scale, the frontage, the site standards, and the uses separately so that we can package districts much more representative of the context that's in place or the context that's envisioned in a plan. Next slide, please. Finally, how do we apply some of these coding ideas to a place like Atlanta? How do we code for place in this place? Next slide. Well, one of the things that we could begin with is Atlanta city design's contexts. So there are 2 contexts, the growth areas, which are made up of the core, the corridors, and some outlying clusters. And the second context, next slide, is in general the conservation areas, those urban neighborhoods, suburban neighborhoods, rural neighborhoods, and the production areas, which are to be conserved on into the future. Next slide, please. So those elements might begin to set the context. And then the work that has been done with UTIL through looking at the pattern analysis of what we have today, which has pointed out to us that the current zoning districts do not reflect the current built form, especially on 2 ends of the spectrum. The rural end of the spectrum has been left to be built out in a very different pattern in new days than it was originally built in. And the urban areas are suffering. Their traditional patterns have also been left out of current zoning. Next slide, please. So let's talk about how one might set up some tools that more accurately reflect what goes on in neighborhoods today and what plans suggest we should be building in those neighborhoods. So one element would be lot width and setbacks. The width of lots sets the rhythm up and down the street of how often buildings occur. The setbacks speak to how gracious and wide a street might be. And so in a rural setting, setbacks are typically substantial. In a suburban setting, they're sort of medium sized. And in the urban setting, setbacks might be quite small. In fact, the buildings might be pulled directly up to the street. Next slide, please. Massing is one of the other key components. So when massing is done correctly, it will, if it's intended to, it will match existing neighborhoods. In this case, we're showing two versions of missing middle housing that are massed quite differently. So on the left-hand side is house scale. We're showing this version of a house 4 district that we created for another one of our client communities. And in that, you'll see 4 units on each lot are being generated. And on the right-hand side is a neighborhood scale of a missing middle district, which is, in this particular case, allowing 8 units on each lot. On the left-hand drawing for that one in the neighborhood 2.5 district, you'll see 2 fourplexes. And then adjacent to them on the corner lot, you'll see 2 townhouses facing the street and 6 townhouses facing the side street. And in both cases, 8 units. And they might look like those photographs that you're seeing on the page, because this is only a 2-story district. They're not out of scale, and they don't end up with underground parking, which is one of the challenges of some of what the city has been doing, City of Atlanta has been doing recently. Next slide. When we talk about massing in these particular instances, typically today we allow the same mass over the entire site. That would be considered this variable mass on the left-hand side. And if we think about it, often there's a preference for front massing in many of the regulations today. Front massing means the bigger portions of the house are out near the street, and we step down towards the backyard, which might have a garage or an accessory dwelling unit, which is much smaller in the backyard. When in fact, we might actually prefer rear massing. If we want to protect the character of a low-scale neighborhood, we would set the front portion of the mass lower than the rear portion of the mass and allow the larger buildings to the rear of the lot in hopes of, if not keeping the front house, at least getting new construction in the front, which more accurately matches its neighbors. I've got some images of that. Next slide. So here are 3 examples of a variable mass on the left-hand side. In this particular case, in Mangum Manor, variable mass means the mass just fits within the envelope, and as long as it fits, it's allowed. In the center in Inman Park is some front massing. These are buildings that are quite tall in the front and might have open yards and step down in the back. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, a rear mass structure in which a smaller bungalow-like portion, 1.5 stories tall, sits in the front of the site, and then a full 2.5 story tall portion sits to the rear, keeping that smaller massing, which might be more compatible with the adjacent neighborhood, in the front of the site. Next slide, please. One other thing that we have done in some settings is to provide for variable requirements, even within the same district. So one of the challenges is many times a district will cover multiple lot sizes. And so on the left-hand page, in that first column, is a set of building coverage maximums that range for a 6,000 square foot lot from 50%. They are getting reduced as you go up in size of lot. So at the 10,000 or larger square foot lot, they've been reduced from 50% to 40%, just to make those buildings fit more successfully as the lots get larger. When we give the exact same coverage to those larger lots, the structures on them begin to look overbulked and out of scale with the neighborhood. In addition, on the right-hand page, you'll see we also are manipulating the floor area ratio, meaning the allocated amount of floor area that can be built on the site. And the floor area ratio in that first column is going for the 6,000 square foot lot from 0.65 down to a 10,000 square foot lot at 0.55. So losing 0.1 FAR as the lot gets larger. Again, trying to keep the building from simply becoming more and more and more massive as you accumulate more land area. Next slide, please. So here you can see what can be the result without these kinds of variable requirements. On the left-hand photo, you'll see a very modest size house that was existing. In the middle is the newer, larger house, not an ugly or awful house, but if we meant it to be in keeping with the existing fabric, it is out of scale with that fabric. So there are decisions to be made about what this neighborhood is supposed to look like in the future. It would be fine to decide it should all be 2.5 stories tall with 3 habitable stories, but it would also be fine for it to remain at that 1-story level that you see in the cottages to the left and right. Now, on the right-hand side is a historic area, and in this particular area, the variable type of requirements have been applied. So Loring Heights on the left with the large building, Adair Park on the right, which has historic district controls. That's one of the only ways to control the massing and also improve that frontage. Make sure that there are no driveways in the front. Make sure we're getting those lovely porches on the buildings in the right-hand photo. Next slide, please. So one of the other challenges is when different intensity things or different kinds of uses abut each other, we often need to make a transition. And these images are sharing with you 2 different kinds of transitions. On the left-hand side are a more typical landscape transition. In this particular case, because this is a shallow lot, as shown, we need a very shallow transition, and therefore we've used a wall and evergreen trees to make that transition. On the right-hand side, we have more land area, and so in fact, we've applied a different district in between, allowing perhaps for a transition from something that might be larger office buildings or other commercial uses, maybe apartment buildings, down to a neighborhood of more like single-family houses. And in between would sit these townhouses and other elements that fit in this residential transition district, which actually sits in the land area in between those 2 widely varying things. So tools for transitions are badly needed in Atlanta. Next slide. So if we were to try to code for frontage, here are some examples of what we might be able to achieve. On the left-hand image is a building with no doors facing the street, very few windows facing the street. In fact, the windows mostly face each other across the carport in the center of the project. On the right-hand side, same kind of a carport configuration, but we have windows and doors and activity porches and other things on the front side. So by adding rules for the frontage, we can assure that we get the right relationship between the building and the street. Next slide. Here are some examples of how that frontage might be regulated. This is a series of frontages from the most intense on the left to the least intense on the right. And you can imagine moving from an intersection, which is a little neighborhood commercial node, back into the surrounding neighborhood. You would go from this village frontage, perhaps to buildings a little closer to the neighborhood, and eventually to the residential frontage itself. And so by controlling the character of those, we can actually manage that urban design transition that is occurring from the center, the most intense portion of that small neighborhood area, back into the neighborhood itself. And they wouldn't have to happen as abruptly as they do today, where 2 districts simply abut one another. Next slide, please. There are also ways to create unique frontages for unique circumstances. In this case, it is a character frontage from one of our other clients that is very specific and has additional details similar to those that might be found in a historic district that require, for example, things like an overhang on the roof to make sure that we get that element. activation of the walls and with windows and doors, making sure there's an entry feature on the house. All of those components can be added to your tool for frontage in specific areas that are quite unique. Next slide. There are also site tools that could be used in Atlanta to manage some of the challenges that are occurring in recent development. On the left-hand slide, you're seeing there a early project along the Beltline. In many cases, people have picked up on the fact that the Beltline should actually be connected to with sidewalks and other active uses facing the Beltway. But in this earliest example, there wasn't a Beltway frontage to tell us how that area should be treated. And therefore, we didn't get any connections between the apartment project and the Beltway, which is an unfortunate thing. In the middle example, we got a parking lot that perhaps we didn't need. If we could actually look behind the building in that center photograph, just back to the left behind that building is a large parking garage. And while everybody loves a little teaser parking and the thought they can park right out front, it might have been better to use this space out front for something a little more exciting than parking, especially since there's on-street parking on one of the adjacent side streets. In the right-hand image at Edgewood, the signage is very, very auto-oriented, in spite of the fact that the signage actually on the building is pedestrian-oriented. Next slide, please. Some of the ways that we could manage the tools for the site would be to change up the way the rules apply. Even where the buildings were the same, we could change the characteristics of the site. So if those buildings are located in an area that is pedestrian oriented, like this District 5, we would have pedestrian oriented standards for signs, for the lighting on the site, for the parking, for the access, for all those other site elements. Whereas if we're in an industrial district, perhaps we would have the standards district number 6 here that we have as an example, which has a very different approach. It does not have parking minimums. It's for industrial areas, and it has a much different package of signs. Next slide, please. So for example, here's an example of parking standards from one of our other codes. There are 5 columns here running all the way from no parking required to 25%, 50%, 75%, and 100% of parking required. 100% of parking would only be required in places with very little mobility and poor access. Whereas the more access and mobility you had, the more you would move back towards the left, towards 50%, 25%, or perhaps even no parking. In spite of the fact that we have no parking minimum, that doesn't mean we generate no parking on the lot. It just means that the developer gets to choose how much parking will be generated on the lot and how much is necessary. Next slide, please. Parking structure design is another element of site that can vary across the community. You're seeing here a spectrum. This is the kind of thing that might be applied in an area like Midtown, where there's lots and lots of parking podiums. So all the way on the right-hand side, that image is showing a wrapped parking deck with active retail and residential above, wrapping the entire parking deck. And on the left-hand side of the first page on the left is just screening of parking, which might be allowable in circumstances where it's not quite so visible or the street itself is not quite so prominent. Next slide, please. Signs are one of those other elements that might change. In suburban settings, you might have, for example, the monument sign that you see in the second image from the left. In a taller district, a high-rise sign, which is completely separate from the on-street signage that might be below at the ground floor, might be appropriate. In residential areas, as you see in that right-hand image, you would have sizes of signs that would be allowed in yards, whether to advertise political candidates or real estate sales or other kinds of things in neighborhoods. Next slide. So use is also going to continue to be applied, but here we want you to think hard about some of the existing non-conforming uses that are in neighborhoods and whether they couldn't possibly be reactivated with their original uses. So that these buildings, you're seeing here, three separate commercial structures, one on the left in Grant Park, the one in the center in Pittsburgh, and the one in the right in Midtown Garden. These are all examples of buildings that could be quite active if we were allowed to place their original uses back in them again. And we are likely to lose these buildings and their character in the neighborhood if we don't consider a little more flexibility for these kinds of things in the future. Next slide. Use is also one of those things that works best if we summarize it, if people can understand the patterns with which uses occur. These are part of a use table from one of our other codes. Principal use table on the first three left pages, an accessory use table on the right, links in the right-hand column. You'll see it on the right-hand page there. Links that link away to use standards or definitions for the uses, and a much more organized way than today's use lists, which are not very rigorous and especially with amendment over time can get out of alignment. Next slide. We would also provide standards for those uses. After we have managed the form, there is still a need in certain cases to have specific standards associated with specific uses. And those should also be included in your code, but they should be linked to those uses, hopefully only once, so that many districts can apply those same standards, even though they may be set up in one place here in the back. Next slide. So finally, if we were coding for a place in Atlanta, if this is an idea that matters to people, if looking at this slideshow becomes, generates a little bit of excitement about what a new zoning code might be with tools that would implement the neighborhood's goals and the city's goals. First, we would create those tools, and next, we would determine how and where they were applied across the city, together with the community. Next slide. So here's a little bit about what this might look like across a spectrum of areas of Atlanta. So this is rural residential. The house is sitting far back from the street. The lot width is large. The lot coverage is very low. The frontage is very residential. It's deep. The access is from the front. This site would clearly be 100% parked on site. If it had a sidewalk, it would be narrow. And the uses allowed here are residential. So it might be house form, neighborhood frontage 1, site package A, and use package residential 1. That's the H1, N1, A, R1. As an example, that would be zoning for a site like this. Next slide, please. When we look instead at suburban residential, maybe we change the form to H2 because now we have, we still have large lot width, low coverage, and modest height, but now the access may still be from the front, but the front setback may not be so deep, and we want to change a few things, but many things would remain the same. So the site elements for this might be package A still, and the use package might be exactly the same, package R1. So in this case, we have changed context substantially, and we are turning some of the dials, but we do not need to turn all of them yet. Next slide. When we get to a setting that is more urban in form, like this one, we might actually choose in a place like this, the West End, for example. The lot width is much narrower. The coverage in FAR, however, is still somewhat modest, and many of the buildings are still of moderate scale. But because this is closer in, maybe we want to reduce the parking that would be required for these. We get a more effective sidewalk area. And there might be some neighborhood commercial allowed, for example, like corner stores. And so that might yield yet another package, H3, N3B, and R2, that would come together to create this kind of a neighborhood. Next slide. If we wanted neighborhood commercial areas to be designated separately from the neighborhood itself, now we would find perhaps another version of form, a very different frontage, which is for the storefront that you see here in the image. You'd find perhaps the same site package with a modest amount of parking and moderate pedestrian improvements, but you might see a use package which now is offering neighborhood commercial and mixed use, residential and the commercial together in the same building. Next slide. Moving to something slightly more intense, seeing urban infill sites, especially those sites that are large scale and can convert all at one time to a new development. In this particular case, you're looking at Glenwood Park. If you could see all the way back in the back of the slide, you would see that there are single family homes, and those transition as you come forward to townhomes, and the townhomes transition to live work areas, and then on up as you come forward to multifamily areas. There are high quality streetscapes and high quality frontages. Lots of pedestrian activity is expected in an area like this. And so again, we are turning the dials. The code is running a little differently in this area. And we would be able to accommodate, especially in these front buildings, residential, commercial, and mixed use in a setting that perhaps had reduced parking because of the availability of parking on street and the availability of transit. So these kinds of infill sites are very important to take advantage of, but to taper off into the existing neighborhoods at the same time. And that's what we could do with this set of tools. Next slide. So another example of suburban infill, not urban infill, is this image, in which case we have, in this particular case, one-story, tall one-story retail uses, which are liners for a parking lot. And the remainder of the project sits back behind, and there are additional taller buildings potentially back behind. But this is still pulled up to the street in a very walkable pattern. We have a nice streetscape here, and buildings front both to the street and also to the parking lot back behind. And that provides a higher quality urban environment in a suburban setting. Next slide. We also have a lot of industrial areas in Atlanta that need to be infilled or regenerated. And this is an example of one of those that's been beautifully reconfigured. We're not likely in the particular instance of this kind of a setting to move the building up to the street. We're rather going to use the building where it was traditionally located. And that may mean there's some parking between the building and the street. But in this case, it has been pedestrianized by creating a high quality streetscape along the edges, narrowing the driveways, and providing pedestrian walkways to the main building back behind from the street. Next slide, please. So all of those are examples of how we might use the kinds of tools we were talking about earlier for, and how those could be used to code for place across the entire city without having to completely change the character of the entire community. And now I believe we're going to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. There are lots of questions that were generated during your presentation. At this time, we'll ask everyone who has a question to please raise your hand. When I call on you, you'll be prompted to unmute your screen, and we'll take questions now from Mr. Jim Martin. Go ahead, Mr. Martin, you're unmuted. I can't hear you though. Is it a computer setting? That we'll come back to you, Mr. Martin. We'll figure out what is going on with the computer. We'll move on now to Atir Chef. Atir?
Yes. Hey, good morning. Good evening, guys. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
All right, let me see. Do I need to turn my camera on? Let's see.
Doesn't matter.
Oh, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I really appreciate this presentation. Lee, great information. One quick question that I have is, with these types of changes that happen and with the preservation of the neighborhoods while trying to have some urban infill, how do you, I guess, mitigate or have the discussions about what some may be concerned as setting a precedence, changing zoning? And during this time when zoning needs to be changed, but there's concerns that allowing it to do so would set such a precedence that it would cause a issue with all development.
So clearly, the zoning needs to implement planning. Planning has been done across the city. Whether it's adequate to support new zoning is unclear right this minute, but lots of further discussion would have to happen before zoning was substantially changed. We would start by preparing packages of zoning that reflect what is in place today, and then zoning might then be allowed to change over time to something that more accurately reflects what the neighborhood is actually like. So we would start with packages that are reflective of your current districts so that they could be applied immediately. And then we would continue the conversation by talking with neighborhoods about applying newer tools, more effective tools, moving into the future, but not without an exercise engaging the community itself.
Paul McMurray?
Yes, I liked your presentation with the options. I think, though, it takes a very good planning department to actually implement them. The more complicated things get, less likely it'll be properly implemented. But that's the question what I wanted to say, though, is I think you make the assumption that somehow our current zoning is evil and it extinguished possibly good uses, as if the neighborhood didn't want it that way. Like for instance, a lot of times the reason why you have quadruplexes is because it was a commercial use already. And that quadruplex was already allowed. The conversion of businesses to residential, I noticed when it was done in Grant Park, it was because those businesses had ceased their life cycle as relevant to the community. That's why they were turned into residents, and probably at least under the scale in which that business operated, it could never return as that business.
Thank you, Mr. McMurray. That's why we're going to be having a lot of neighborhood conversations. Some neighborhoods want to retain neighborhood commercial uses or reimagine neighborhood commercial spaces that once existed. So we'll be having lots of conversations with the neighborhood. Thank you so much. Mr. Martin, we'll try it again. Jim Martin. Okay, Mr. Martin,
Okay.
You're unmuted.
Can you hear me now?
Sir. Yes,
Sorry.
sir.
When you called on me, I unmuted myself just as you unmuted me, which caused me to be muted again. I don't know. So there are some neighborhoods whose character, and mine is one of them, is inherently eclectic. And so if we're going to construct a zoning code that sort of preserves that character, we're either going to have to permit everywhere the most intense land use and the most massive built scale, or we're going to have to pick it apart with all sorts of little micro districts within one district in order to preserve that. And so I'm wondering, is there a third way, or do you have one of those two ways in mind, or how would we deal with that scenario?
So to start with, eclecticism can actually be coded for. There are some successful examples around the country. Just look up zoning for eclectic uses, and you might find some. So I would be hopeful that we could figure out some patterns that would actually make sense. It perhaps the bones of what you're looking at there are not quite as eclectic as you might think, although you might be exactly right that it is extremely eclectic. So it would take a lot of analysis, I think, to get something like that right. That analysis has not been conducted yet, not at the block by block through the entire city scale. But working with your neighborhood, one would hope that we could achieve something that's at least the equivalent of the current zoning, if not an improvement over that.
Mary Norwood.
Impressed with this. Having lived here for many years and being in a neighborhood that was not able to get protection and an area that has not been able to get any protection, we have essentially people with a lot of protection, whether SBIs or historic districts or whatever, and then we have the everyone else, you get whatever comes. And so I really like the way that you have had the different elements that can then be combined to reflect what is basically going on in that neighborhood. So I am very pleased with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brad Hepner.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you. Two quick questions. One is, has there ever been any consideration to model a little bit more like a Houston, where there's no zoning, but it's controlled by ordinance, in which there's not a restriction of use, but there is a restriction of building type? That would preserve some of those eclectic neighborhoods that have been mentioned.
It could. We're working with Houston right now and on talking with their Livable Places Action Committee about how to get some more density in the city and which of their rules would need to be changed in order to do that. So we have a fair understanding of Houston's toolkit. And I would say it's at least as complex, if not more complex, than most every other cities in the country. All that's missing really is the zoning map. So yes, it's unmapped and you get to make a choice about what you would like to be. But once you've made that choice, the number of rules is the same or more than most other places have. And we still have to deal with things like stormwater and driveway widths and fire code and all of those things that impact urban character. So I count Houston in pretty much with everybody else when we talk about that. Has Atlanta talked about that? I suspect they've not really had that conversation. I'm not certain that Atlanta looks to Houston as a model for anything other than perhaps speedy housing generation, which it is a great model for.
We have another question. What are ways that the discrepancies between zoning and land use can be addressed?
Great question. Takes time and analysis. Land use alone is not the answer to the analysis that we would require to put this kind of zoning in place, because we'd want more than just use to describe a context. But it takes figuring out a little bit about what the context is. Broader categories of use might no longer be the right answer to how we think about the city in blobs. This blob is residential, this blob is not. We may be thinking more carefully about like the core contexts and the clusters and the corridors and the other components that already exist in Atlanta city design. which could be implemented by a toolkit like we're talking about. But yes, those need to be brought in alignment so that the plan and the zoning are in direct alignment for sure.
Before we wrap up the question period, are there any questions from any of our viewing parties? All right, no questions from any of our viewing parties. Thank you so much, Lee.
You're
Oh,
welcome.
we do have
Thank
one.
you.
Oh, so
Councilman
reemerge?
Winslow had a comment?
Unmute so they can hear. Yes, can you guys hear us now?
Sure, go ahead.
So I was, this is Councilmember Cleta Winslow, and good evening. So I heard Councilmember-elect Mary Norwood talking about some areas that aren't protected in the city of Atlanta. So we have a number of SPIs around the city. I just introduced some legislation earlier this year around the Atlanta University, Ashview Heights, Booker T. Washington community to add some needed protections. So would we be talking about keeping those SPIs that we have in the city in place and then looking at those areas that may not have the type of protections that are needed? Or are we talking about doing a whole rewrite? Because we
Those SPIs would be converted to the new districts if we could, in a way that provided the exact same protection that's in the SPI today. And to the extent possible, we would take what we learned from that and apply it in other similar areas that have the same kind of context so that there might be more protection elsewhere around the city. We would build that toolkit, though, basically from the SPI as it exists today.
So we would take what's in the SPI and convert it to, so let me say this. So what we did with SPI 4 in the area that I mentioned was we took it from what its original form is and we put it into the SPI that was supposed to be a compatible comparison to the old zoning. So now you're saying that with the new SPIs that we may have introduced and passed, that we would take those SPIs or whatever we recently converted them to, if it's MUs or whatever.
And convert them one more time.
And convert them again.
Yes.
To something that's similar or compatible. But
Yes.
just using other, I saw you say N2 and H.
Yes, it might have different names, but fundamentally you would be in the same system that the rest of the city would be in. Instead of being over here in a little special thing, you'd be part of a system that was protecting everyone and not just that particular area.
Okay, so let me ask another question, because there was something that recently came up by a council member to allow, and then this will be my last question, to allow for 2 or more units, anywhere from 2 units up to 12 units in a neighborhood, and to be built on a vacant lot. It could be, on a commercial corridor or perhaps in a neighborhood, and not have it go through the NPU system. Are we talking about that as well?
Not right this minute, because that's not part of the existing code, and we are talking about starting with a conversion of the existing code. Now, there may be neighborhoods that choose to have more units within the form that they are allowed, and so we could preserve the exact same form and allow more units. And we are talking with lots of our client cities about that issue. It does improve equity across the city, and it is a valuable tool. But I think that is a continuing conversation in Atlanta that's not really been held yet, and it needs to be held at the neighborhood by neighborhood level. We're not going to push it down anybody's throats, but we are interested in having a toolkit that allows for that in places that are interested in that.
I don't see any more hands, Caleb.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Lee, and thank you everyone for your questions. I think again, I was very excited about this, and I'm glad to see from the comments that so many of you are as well. And so what we wanted to do now is to allow you an opportunity to provide a little bit of feedback on what you've heard. So if you are in a viewing party, get your phone out and be ready to go to the Menti account. And we wanted to ask you a couple of questions. So Yinka, if we could bring up the first one. We are interested in knowing, based on what you've heard, if you've ever worked with the zoning code and if you think that it's easy to use and understand today. You heard Councilwoman Winslow talking about the SPIs, and in fact, we have almost 260 different zoning districts today. So if you've interacted with the code, do you find it easy to use and understand today? And I will turn it on for our folks on Menti. So rarely, sometimes, mostly, or no answer. Okay. We'll give folks at the viewing party a little bit more time. If you are at the viewing party again, and you may have logged out, the URL is menti.com, MENTI.com. And the password is 24921517. Okay, great. It looks like quite a few sometimes, which aligns with what our observations have been. Okay. The next question is going into a little bit more detail. As you think about recent development that you've seen in your neighborhood, so don't think about somewhere halfway across the city, but in the areas that you live and that you experience every day, do you think the new development is fitting in well with the existing patterns? Or is it something that's compatible with the character of your neighborhood that you may love and value, or is it something that's very incompatible? Rarely, sometimes, mostly, or no answer. Okay. The folks at the viewing parties are saying quite a few rarely. Also, we've got quite a few rarely and sometimes on the Zoom. So it looks like quite a bit of alignment. We'll give you a couple more seconds to respond. Okay, we got a few more rarely and a few more sometimes. Okay, so not generally speaking, it seems like the current zoning code, as you see it, is not producing the kind of development that you think, generally speaking, fits in. So with that said, we talked a little bit about existing patterns, but we'd also like to know if you think that development fits in with what you think is the vision of your neighborhood. That may be preserving the existing pattern, as we just talked about, or it may be very different. For example, if you think about Midtown proper, the sort of commercial areas, there's a very strong vision for what that area should be. There's a very strong vision for what South Atlanta neighborhood should be, and many of the other neighborhoods have plans. How do you think the zoning code and the development that's resulting in is aligning with your vision of what your neighborhood should be in the future? Okay, mostly, rarely. Okay, so again, maybe doing a little bit better in certain areas on this one. Okay, but a lot of rarely. Okay, we'll give about 5 more seconds. Okay. Great. I think everyone's done. And the final one of the final questions is, now that you've heard this idea that we could have a zoning ordinance that would allow us to regulate form and design in a way that the current code cannot do, we're interested in knowing, how important do you think it is to actually incorporate some of these ideas? First, in what we're calling the single family and low density residential area, those conservation areas that Lee mentioned in city design. So if you think about Atlanta, it's the treed neighborhoods that we all know and love. How important are these ideas to look at, to explore creating a zoning code that can support in those areas? Is it very important, somewhat important, neutral, or of course, other? Feel free to write into the chat. So it looks like we've got almost 2/3 of, or about half now of folks in the Zoom thinking it's very important or somewhat important, and then a very similar response in the viewing party. Okay, great, great, great. And then the final question is, we remembered Lee mentioned that Atlanta City Design talks about the sort of single family and low density residential areas, but it also talks about the commercial and mixed use areas, the growth areas. How important do you think these ideas are to utilize in the growth areas? The Midtown propers, the Buckhead SPIs, the Campbellton Road corridors, the areas that we're seeing a lot of growth and development today. Is it important there as well? We're interested in asking these two questions really to see if there's a difference in implementing these in one type of area versus another. So interestingly enough, this one is even more popular in the sort of multifamily, commercial, and mixed use areas. Great. We'll give you a couple more seconds. Okay. Wonderful. Wonderful. And with that said, we're going to go now to our second presentation by local architect Pavan Iyer that is going to talk about various issues related to using leftover space in the city, in our neighborhoods, and in our commercial areas. You may recall from one of our earlier presentations about COVID-19 that we began to touch on the idea of changing ways to think about valuable space in different parts of our city. And so Pavan is going to talk to you a little bit about some of his research into how we can make better use of land, better use of open spaces in various parts of Atlanta for your consideration. So with that said, I'll turn it over.
Hey, just got unmuted. Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Pavan Iyer. I'm really excited, really excited to be here. I'm excited to share with you a lot of actually what I've been working on since basically I was in grad school. So you're going to actually be seeing a lot of my student work today. So please don't judge me too hard because I was a student back then, but I'm excited to kind of share the high level concepts and hope some of you, respond to it. Next slide, please. So it's kind of cool because in my life, it's actually come a little bit full circle, but I think a lot of what you're seeing today actually influenced me to eventually create my own design and development practice. I own a firm called 8 Village. We're a place-based design and development practice that we're trying to seek and create positive change in communities. We're really big on boots on the ground type of engagement to understand where we are and what we need to do and who we need to work with. Next slide, please. A lot of this is actually rooted in my family history. My last name is Iyer, and this comes from, back in the 1600s, essentially, there's a group of people from Tamil Nadu that emigrated to another state called Karnataka, where my parents are from. And this small group of community was called the Ashtagrama. This group of people was asked to actually come down to Karnataka by request of the King of Karnataka to essentially set up a group of villages at the request of this existing government. They were everything from priests to architects to agriculturalists, farmers, with the goal of getting together, boots on the ground, understanding where they are and putting their heads together to help improve the community. And this term called Ashtagrama is actually literally translated as the 8 villages. Next slide. And so through this, that was what I strive to do in terms of my own practice, was to take this ethos of the Ashtagrama and apply it to community development, community design, and trying to take this idea to root ourselves and where we're working to help foster and create a sense of place in the projects we do. Next slide. So currently we've kind of built ourselves to a small team. I hope there's some small business owners out there because I'm one of them, and I'm really proud to say that we're starting to expand in what we're doing. Something we've tried to do is put together a team that has a wide spectrum of backgrounds and perspectives to help really bring their own different perspectives to the places we work and root ourselves with. We have everything from, of course, me. I'm the one on the screen that looks exactly like me. And I've grown up in urban areas throughout my whole life and done urban design a lot in my life. But we also have people on our team that are from outside the United States, from rural areas, places that have different architecture, community development, and definitely zoning policy. And so we have this wide spectrum of people to hopefully see the communities in their own lens, but also contribute to where they are and where we're working. Next slide, please. So with that said, like a lot of what we try to do and a lot of where we work is we've learned that the perspectives we have as a team can help us see space in a lot of different ways. And we use that to kind of have conversations with communities to see and find that there are a lot of value in places that we consider to be untapped. And a lot of how I've defined these untapped places, especially for the purposes of our conversation today, is residual spaces. And this is very loosely defined, again, from my graduate thesis as spaces that I saw as untapped, places that currently we're not maybe serving a public or social or environmental value. And some of these places ended up being places I don't think we ever considered that could be something else. So I wanted to actually start by running through some examples to show you some different residual spaces that I'm sure many of you may know and hopefully through your own experiences have seen and experienced. Next slide. So just as like hopefully a example that I'm guessing most of you have experienced yourself, believe it or not, the Atlanta Beltline is a residual space in the way I've kind of defined it through my thesis. And for those of you who are aware, I'm sure it was once an abandoned rail corridor. And one person came along one day and said, I think that could be a transit corridor in our park. And lo and behold, here we are today. It's certainly not without its flaws, which we'll touch on today in terms of how we can think about that with unlocking spaces like this. But hopefully it's been interesting to see how a space that originally was just abandoned as a rail corridor has become kind of this different vibrant space for people and the environment as well. Next slide. And so something to hopefully stretch our minds as well is that residual spaces can actually come in all different shapes and sizes. It's not just spaces like the Beltline, but it could be your own front yard for those of you who have a front yard. So this is actually an example. There's actually even a company, I think based in Tucker, called Grow with the Flow. And a lot of where they started with their thesis for their company was to see if some of these front yards could be urban gardens and places that can produce, again, kind of this idea of a public good or something that can, be beneficial to the environment, in this case, producing food. So this is actually an image of a front yard that had been converted into an actual urban garden and space. Next slide, please. And similar, again, in the spirit of residual spaces coming in all shapes and sizes, this is kind of your standard streetscape buffer space, but this particular one is called the 20th Street Biophilia Garden in San Francisco. And I'm sure many of you in Atlanta have seen that we typically have kind of this 3 to 5 foot landscape strip that kind of separates the sidewalk from the street where cars are. And this is an example of, there was a community kind of driven process that they saw this as an opportunity to actually create actual gardens and pollinators through these landscape buffers. So they weren't just serving as kind of your typical urban divider, but in this case, there was this idea to convert it into something that's beneficial for the environment. Next slide, please. This might be a type of kind of residual space conversion that many are familiar with, particularly over the last year during the pandemic. The image you're seeing on the right is a before and after of a space actually in College Park on Main Street. It's this idea that a lot of the street parking actually has been converted into outdoor gathering space. Some of us call it parklets, but in general, it's this idea that that was a space that was parking, but given certain community needs and particularly small business needs, in this case, these spaces seen as again residual or left over in a way, a space that may not have been again, this current use you're seeing today could be kind of something that's different and more vibrant for the community, and in this case outdoor seating. Next slide, please. Here's like a crazier example, again, just to hopefully stretch people's mind that kind of came up in my research while I was in school, is a lot of these residual spaces that exist even around the world have actually been used to prototype and test not only like super crazy architectural concepts like this, which I'm sure is very subjective aesthetically, but also has provided a methodology to prototype potential community needs and spaces to see and fulfill some of those needs. So this space actually is from an abandoned kind of, an unused alley and airspace in Moscow. They have a lot of interesting conditions where you have buildings that have no windows where it comes up to this alleyway. And this community in Moscow specifically was looking to create more creative office space. It's kind of this neighborhood that was full of entrepreneurs and artists. And so they decided to prototype this and test out, like, can we use some of our air rights to, create more creative office and satisfy a need here. Next slide, please. Maybe some of you have seen this example. This is actually on Marietta Street. It used to be, and I think the above image on the before, on the top right image on the before, that was, I think, from maybe 2007, I believe. It kind of looks like and feels like a rail buffer and rail corridor, but it was eventually unlocked to allow for something like infill housing. And so I'm sure some of you may have driven by this, but I'm sure if you had seen this, the top image before, it's kind of interesting to see that, it seems like just something that's dividing the rail from the street. And it's just kind of this leftover space that, I think often we as people are kind of conditioned and used to having, like, just buffers that separate us from something else. But sometimes we don't realize that a lot of that space can be valuable and serve, in this case, housing need. Next slide, please. Kind of in a similar spirit, this is actually from a good friend and mentor of mine in New Orleans. His name is Jonathan Tate. He is kind of similar to my company. He is an architect and developer looking at ways to repurpose spaces and for community good. For those of you who have been in New Orleans, they have a lot of crazy shotgun lots, and they have a lot of spaces like this that used to be setbacks. And currently, Jonathan's actually looking at reusing a lot of these spaces to create starter homes. As the lots are smaller and constrained, but they're conducive to buildings that can actually provide a lower price point, for example. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so you can see that, a lot of cities and a lot of places around the world have a lot of this untapped potential that we may not normally expect. And it was actually during my time in graduate school that I started to realize and really question like a lot of these kind of open spaces and understanding like why some of these spaces exist. So something I wanted to also do was kind of walk you through just a couple of pictures that were actually from my walk that I used to actually bike and walk usually from my apartment in the Kirkwood-Edgewood area all the way to Georgia Tech. It was about a 3 to 4 mile hike. And because I was kind of a nerd, for those of you who went to Georgia Tech, hello, all you nerds as well. I was actually constantly thinking about things like affordable housing, gentrification, things like that, and just trying to understand what can we do about it or think and, stretch our minds, as an architecture student. And during my walk, I used to see all these spaces. And next slide, actually, please. And this is actually an example, like one I would take different routes to, get to my class. And, as an example, this is kind of a leftover space I saw, and I was just questioning why it was empty, why I never saw people there, why I never saw trees there, why it's actually not actually good for stormwater management. It's just lawn. This example is actually a throwaway space that was resultant from the Chick-fil-A and coming in. And typically a lot of these fast food restaurants and maybe more suburban type of retail results in kind of this open space that just becomes kind of throwaway space. And so I question, like, why is this not a park? Why is this not like a tree orchard? Why is this not even even like affordable housing or something? I was just trying to figure out, like, why is this space here? Next slide, please. This is another one. If you see on the bottom, this is actually a Google Maps image of where the above picture is. On the left side of the image, that's where Georgia Tech is. On the right side, that's kind of closer to the North Avenue Transit Station. And so this is, again, on my walk from, I would get off North Ave. I would take just different and crazy paths to get to school just because I was always interested in exploring the city. And this one kind of popped up on my radar where I was like, why is there parking in front of parking? And the space was actually interestingly shaped and currently, again, similarly, didn't seem to be serving a need for kind of the community in terms of people and the environment. It's asphalt, so it's not really serving an environmental need and potentially causing harm there. And so again, I was just questioning, like, why does the space exist? And in this case, like, why do we have parking in front of parking? And so, and particularly in kind of an important node. So in this case, this is a space that was, again, within a very close, like 1 block distance from a transit station, 1 block distance from Georgia Tech itself. And so why was such an important space in our urban environment, not serving, a environmental or human need? Next slide, please. So again, just like on my walk, I continue to see spaces like this. I'm sure some of you may be familiar with this one. This is close to the pencil factory lofts. And again, I have never personally seen people or, again, this is another lawn space. So again, questioning like, why could this not improve our tree canopy? Why could this not be better for stormwater? Why could this not be better for people? Next slide, please. Similarly, just like similar to the last one in nature, I started to see that a lot of these spaces, again, were resultant from kind of almost like disruptive planning at times. So this is an example where we have essentially something like a suburban type of retail use, the Dollar Tree, and kind of like the Chick-fil-A example y'all saw on the first one of the first slides. This is again that throwaway space that kind of happens. And again, I question, like, why could this not be better? And currently the use that some of the throwaway space is providing is a giant billboard. And so it felt like this could better face the community, better face people on the street. Next slide, please. And so the first thing I started to do to really start to understand some of these spaces, and just this is just one example of just many, was like trying to understand, like, well, what historically were a lot of these spaces before the space they are today. So I actually went into a lot of historic maps, a lot of Sanborn maps from everything from the 1920s to 1960s. On the left is actually a map from the 1920s at the intersection of around like Moreland Avenue and DeKalb. And around the 60s, the state highway was put in, or Moreland became a state highway, and we got what I hopefully endearingly call the love handles that kind of come down from DeKalb Avenue down to Moreland today. This is actually one example of a lot of how a lot of the state highway infrastructure and different type of these different type of planning practices that were prioritizing automobile access, automobile flow, kind of disrupted the existing urban environment. In this case, it changed the original fabric that contained homes and commercial spaces along Moreland. And today, actually, it has created this leftover, hard to develop parcel that's currently locked by our zoning and not currently serving a social or environmental use. Next slide, please. Sorry. So this is actually literally a page, and I think everything you're going to see, which again, I'm both excited and hopefully y'all are excited too to see my student work. And so this is actually a page from my student thesis, and it's kind of fun to present and see again. So here, this is actually kind of showing that if you see those 3 bubbles, that's Midtown, Inman Park, and Candler Park in terms of just like these bubbles. And I kind of focused on these 3 areas just to start to understand residual spaces in general, as this was kind of my path from kind of the Kirkwood, Edgewood, Candler Park area over to Midtown at Georgia Tech. Next slide, please. One particularly fascinating node that I looked at was Inman Park. And so with each of these kind of areas I passed through on my walk and on my bike ride, I tried to define, just in my own way, kind of what kind of nodes that I felt were significant in my walk that I felt like were worth diving deeper into from like a mapping standpoint to understand residual spaces. So this is Inman Park, basically. That green, thicker green arrow and green line, that's the Atlanta Beltline on the East Side Trail. That the red lines you're seeing, that's DeKalb Avenue to the south, Edgewood Avenue, and then you have the Freedom Trail, that dotted green line kind of going east-west. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with this area today. And it acts as a very significant point in the overall city in terms of activity and these different major corridors that are connecting our city. Next slide, please. And something I started to do is just overlay different things to understand again what is causing and where these residual spaces potentially coming from. And what you're seeing here is actually the current zoning map that we have today. And you can see Inman Park is particularly colorful. I had a really fun time, and hopefully those of you that might be graphic designers might understand some of the fun I went through to create this. But I had a lot of diving deep into it. A lot of these residual spaces seem to occur in different tangencies. Atlanta in particular has this single use type of zoning, as in like we kind of split different uses into specific zones. Like we have single family of certain sizes meeting industrial uses. Blue, for example, is considered industrial, red commercial on this map. And where a lot of these things meet, I realized there were residual spaces occurring. I also realized, actually, if you go to the next slide, I also realized there were things like disruptions in the urban fabric that caused it, like I had spoken about before. So if you can kind of see on the north part of this circle, where Freedom Parkway is kind of going through. And so to hopefully try to orient people, and I also explain this image, is all of these dots are different marks I made on like, this looks like a space, this looks like a space, all of these for me to later try to understand like where and how the space existed. And then if you see kind of at the topish part of the circle, there's all those red dots. Those are all kind of these crazy kind of odd shaped parcels and resultant kind of spaces that actually came from Freedom Parkway coming and kind of disrupting our grid and disrupting this fabric. And so all of those have kind of resulted in these spaces that are currently locked or difficult to develop through our existing zoning code. And so I started to understand like, how did this happen? Why did this happen? And, how can we actually unlock these? And so that kind of darker gray circle within the larger gray circle was where I started to even focus more in on to start to prototype and understand how these spaces have occurred. Next slide, please. And so what I started to do is I realized that there's a lot of different ways residual spaces can happen and be categorized. And so this is actually one compendium of several types of residual spaces I discovered on my walks. You have everything from like on the top left, surface lots, to the bottom right, which are like super crazy, weird carved out lots that have come from different types of buildings and different types of developments coming in different shapes of sizes and kind of leaving leftover area that is currently, not being used in, necessarily a significant community way. Next slide, please. One kind of fascinating example that, again, I was just drawn to as, I guess, somewhat of an urban explorer myself, was these alleyways. They always kind of seemed like portals to another world whenever I passed by one. And even today, if I see a cool alleyway, I'm going to try to explore it. I'm, again, that kind of nerd. But I was always looking at these and realized there's a lot of these kind of left over, and always wondering like, wow, these kind of look like, their own street. They look like they have their own life. So I was always just curious on like what the space was being used for. And they always seem to be either being used in different ways, and depending on the neighborhood I was in, but also not being used in different ways. So I was always curious about what this could be in terms of a potential residual area. Next slide, please. And something I started to find was kind of how zoning has again started to influence and create these spaces. And this particular triangle lot that I'm sure that many of you might be familiar with. It's kind of along Highland Ave. It's kind of this triangular shaped area that's flat, currently just lawn. It's essentially throwaway open space. So a lot in our zoning code, particularly with the development next door, this is part of what's called a larger planned use development. And part of these planned use developments is they typically have to have a certain percentage of open space, specifically public open space. But often with these developments, it ends up with something like this that just becomes kind of throwaway green space that isn't necessarily programmed for any kind of community needs. That this could be a park, this could be again a tree orchard, this could be some sort of interesting prototypical retail or rotating something, because a lot of these spaces, particularly like this one, exist in even nodes in our fabric. This particular one, if you're familiar, there's a sidewalk that actually takes you from Highland Ave down to the Beltline. So that's a significant moment in our city where people are, connecting to each other in different ways. But unfortunately, because of the zoning code and different lot constraints, this lot has kind of sat empty. I think at most I've seen, dogs pooping there, and I love dogs, but ideally we can think about and stretch our minds to see, what could this become? Next slide, please. Similarly, I was, again, just being a crazy land shaped nerd. This is one I was particularly interested in. Basically, this piece of land is along the belt line. I'm sure some of you may have just seen kind of this open space that's kind of this lawn coming down to the belt line on the East Side Trail. It basically got shaped by, to the south, kind of this townhome development that is a little bit arbitrary in the way that it's kind of shaped and formed. It's kind of serving the needs of the townhome development itself in terms of the way it was planned. And then to the north, you can kind of see there's this weird kind of open rectangle that's kind of carving that bird shape of the parcel. That is actually a communication easement that currently there's kind of these wires coming down to hold this giant communications tower. So all of these different things, plus kind of you have this curvy belt line and you have this curvy Freedom Parkway, all of these things coming together have kind of shaped this really strange and this really weird piece of land that as an architecture student, I was extremely fascinated by. And I actually used it as a jumping off point to just prototype, my own student project to figure out like, what can I do with this as an architect? Next slide, please. And so to kind of also hit home on that lot, these spaces, just like the one you saw, can be nodes in the urban fabric. Next slide, please. And so with that, like I was focused on this site, again, during my student thesis to like understand like, well, if this is a node, how can we improve it? And so I actually really honed in on this, tried to really understand the existing conditions to see like, what could this become? And of course, looking at a macro view, I started to realize like, oh, this is literally where Freedom Parkway meets the Beltline. This is where you have a lot of important, different commercial uses meeting different residential uses. Like this is actually a place that, people and the environment are starting to intersect. But when you go out to this site, you realize that currently, it's not necessarily designed for people, like it's not designed as a park or anything, but it's also not actually even serving an environmental need. There's kind of this concrete channel that kind of takes stormwater and almost dumps it onto the belt line. So it's not even, serving a stormwater management type of need. And so what I attempted to do as a student was take on, just like a crazy architecture project. Hopefully architects, in the room right now, or I guess in the virtual room, right now can hopefully, relate to this, to find a way to challenge myself to see like, can I create something in this space that brings together the built environment, brings together people with the natural environment to actually help improve this space for both environmental and social good. Next slide, please. So in this case, I took a pass. The sketch on the right was actually the first sketch I ever did for the lot, and I was fascinated by the drop in topography. Next slide, please. And a lot of what I looked at was like, how can I, create something in the built environment that, creates the synergy between people and nature. So for example, right in between this building and the existing townhomes, I thought, in this case, it'd be a great space for Tree Atlanta to have some sort of orchard and something that rotates, that gives a good visual. This being, again, this node of these two places could celebrate the existing nature and a lot of what the Beltline's trying to accomplish from a natural and nature perspective. Thinking about how the building itself can improve stormwater management. So creating kind of this crazy kind of stormwater park that kind of fronts the building, but also having views from inside, in this case, having different affordable housing units that face kind of a stormwater park. So it feels like you're within nature and the Beltline. So again, and you can even see as a student, I got really crazy with it. I was like, why do we not even have solar panels on the top of the Freedom Parkway tunnel? It's just like this giant concrete thing that was built to like shelter cars from ice. And so like, we at least try to put solar panels on it to provide a community need. So this is a fun project I did. Just next slide, please. That just attempted to rethink and hopefully give that site, a different perspective. Oh, next slide, please. So this is kind of the resulting frontage that, I developed, and kind of regardless of the aesthetic, I'm sure it's subjective and always happy to hear people's feedback. But again, I was just focused on trying to figure out like, what can we do with this? And, the resultant thing that I got just changed my own perspective through my own design process, realizing that, man, there's a lot of different opportunities with these seemingly seemingly dead type of sites. Next slide, please. So in order to start unlocking these spaces, I realized that we really need to think about targeted policy mechanisms. Next slide, please. And in particular, thinking about policy mechanisms that could not only include community engagement to create the actual policy, but can target these spaces specific for the context they're in. Each space I found through my walk was unique in its own way, and each space felt like it needed community input and kind of this determining like what is this community's or neighborhood need in terms of what this type of space or how we allow these unusual constraints and to be redefined through a predetermined set of conditions. So there's this idea and concept that I researched and found that's been used not only in actually the state of Georgia, but also throughout the country, called floating zones. Next slide, please. And basically floating zones, it's essentially a type of zoning or conditions that essentially that float above, and these they're conditions and parameters that are pre-decided by kind of a local community process. And these conditions can include everything from affordable housing goals, tree preservation goals, stormwater management goals. It can be restricted to specific neighborhoods and geographies. It can even define certain timelines. And essentially these parameters float and crazy lots that are not unlocked yet. You can only unlock them when the certain parameters that we've predetermined are met. And so essentially these parameters can allow communities and us, as a neighborhood or us as a community to decide when, where, and how we want things to happen in very specific ways. Next slide, please. And part of this is really trying, even though we have kind of this kind of tactical potential policy mechanism that could allow us to target these lots or target spaces in different ways and include the community in the future of its life, the goal should still be to think long-term. Next, please. So as in like combining kind of this tactical idea with floating zones that again are thinking through like a targeted policy mechanism and thinking with the long-term in mind, we can really think through like ideas that allow for equitable development if specific situations, only specific situations, and only when they're met in a predetermined set and like predetermined conversations that communities and kind of localized groups have had. Next slide, please. And in terms of a process, something I've thought about really hard with my practice and something I hope to see that, if particularly a policy mechanism like this has traction, is that in order to figure out what our values are as a neighborhood and what these predetermined set of conditions could be, it really requires and has to have this boots on the ground engagement and exploration. Next slide, please. So essentially, just as an example, I personally have felt that almost like replicating my walk or replicating boots on the ground observation is a great way to even start understanding potential untapped value in again these residual spaces. So the image you're actually seeing on the scene on the screen is our first pass and an example of an engagement tool that we've come up with that we've kind of endearingly called walk shops. This is an image from a walk shop we did in Sweet Auburn to identify potential placemaking opportunities on Hilliard. And in order to kind of bring together the community in terms of residents, business owners, policy makers, council people, we decided to say, like, why can't we just walk together, observe what we see, and talk about it. Next slide, please. And so these walks kind of involved kind of starting at the MARTA station on King Memorial, just walking down this kind of a half-mile path on Hilliard, and we ended in Noni's actually, and had a sandwich, talked together and just talked about what did we just see and what did we observe. And again, the groups we got together, it wasn't just like residents, it wasn't just policymakers. We tried to find ways to include everyone in this walk together to kind of spear kind of casual, organic conversation around this, almost like you're walking with your neighbors. Next slide, please. And so through that, we just had like a fun compendium of a wide spectrum of ideas of how to like even reuse or rethink kind of, again, residual spaces actually. And so this is kind of one of my favorites from the walk, from my buddy Johnny Martinez. He's actually the owner of Georgia Beer Garden and Joystick, if you've ever patronized those. But he had this idea that, we have these billboards that face cars that do not face people and don't necessarily serve a social or environmental good. So why could we not at least look at the back of billboards that face us to repurpose them for something like public art or something that actually provides a community benefit? Next slide. And so I actually kind of wanted to end on what was my favorite picture. This was on a bike ride on my way home from a studio when I was in school. For those of you who may or may not be familiar, this is the Jackson Street Bridge. It's, I think, definitely one of my favorite views of downtown Atlanta. But it's actually kind of a cool and interesting prototype for, the residual space kind of concepts I talked about, where the space wasn't necessarily designed to be, it's become somewhat of a community gathering space and a vibrant place that people connect and enjoy each other and enjoy the city. But because of how people have been using it, it's started to evolve into and becoming rooted in as a community gathering space, where even today there's been planning efforts and more evolution that this space is going to become more formally a gathering space. And so it's one of my favorite spots in the city. It's something that I know actually even inspired me to create my practice. We think a lot about not just like the view, we think about the people enjoying the view. And so, and we're excited to see, also what becomes of this. So next slide, please. And so thank you again. I hope you enjoyed a lot of what we talked about, and happy to talk through questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Pavan. An interesting stuff. Do we have any questions?
Brad Hepner.
Thank you. I'm just curious, as you move from theoretical to reality, how the fact that a majority of these residual spaces are privately owned spaces affects the plan of, implementing, say, this should be a park, or this should be an orchard, or this should be a X or Y or Z, when again, vast majority of those spaces are privately owned.
Making sure I'm unmuted still. Okay, cool. That's a great question. So again, the first step that maybe I should have emphasized even more, in my opinion, is first, we really do have to start with that boots of the ground engagement, in terms of really understanding that local context on what is our predetermined set of values as a neighborhood, or predetermined set of goals as a community. So whether even it's public or private, those goals need to be set in place to either incentivize or ensure that those type of spaces, private or publicly owned, can be what that specific community wants it to be. So whether or not, like you're saying, like as private land, it's a little more difficult to unlock in terms of that landowner has the control over it. But ideally, if it's going to be unlocked, the community and this local context can help decide that it can only be unlocked if these predetermined conditions are met. So just in my opinion, the way I've thought about it is I would see that as the first goal, in terms of whether it's private or public, we need to have this predetermined set of values.
Jonathan Miller.
Hi, Jonathan Miller, Inman Park, and I know some of those weird little spaces fairly well because I've lived here a long time. I guess my question is, your drawings seem to focus first on what could be built there, and maybe taking a look at some of the comments about wait, we want our green spaces. Was that just because it's cooler to draw buildings, or was it just because that's what you think should go there? I guess my concern is that we have a fair amount of density in Mint Park, and with this rewrite, we're probably going to get slightly more dense. But so I guess I'm with other people who look at this and say, wait, we need our corner of green spaces, even if they're.
think it's frozen, but I think I got the gist of the question. Yeah, again, kind of reiterating, number one, that drawing you saw was, it was cool to draw a building because I was an architecture student. It's like I literally needed a site to draw something from the built environment. And so it was a very theoretical project. And to your point, it was actually just what I wanted to see. In terms of like kind of reiterating what I had answered before, let's pretend that space could be unlocked. It would have to go through that boots on the ground type of engagement process to determine what it is. So you being a part of the Inman Park community and other members of the Inman Park community, I would hope would have a very strong dialogue about it to understand that, well, that's an, if we have this type of unlockable space with these predetermined parameters, ideally it's a green space, ideally it's a tree orchard, tree preservation, stormwater management. So that drawing you saw was literally because I was an architecture student, and to your point, it was cool to draw buildings, and I just enjoyed drawing it and learned a lot of architecture stuff from it. But it was not at all a suggestion of mine that that's exactly what we should do.
Mr. McMurray, what's your question for Pavan?
What specific zoning actions can be taken to unlock these things? I mean, you showed a lot of examples of where they're located and what you do with them, but the reality is they're probably out of the way, inaccessible, and often owned by a person who does not want to give it up easily. So I just wanted to know what actions you would take and how the zoning code would be changed.
Yeah, well, a lot of what I discovered is actually a lot of these lots, for better or worse, are unfortunately not out of the way. A lot of them are actually critical nodes in the environment, which kind of makes it even more difficult, like you said, that a lot of them are privately owned. But I think one of the examples I showed that was privately owned is a crucial connector from the Beltline to like the actual neighborhood. And so that's actually a lot of the residual spaces I discovered that that exist in that nature. So again, ideally, like whether or not those spaces become something, we want to make sure we you can call them protections, you can call them conditions, but we have parameters in place that if they were to become something, if that private landowner were to take action and do something with the lot, even if it was to change hands, we want to ensure it is what we have decided as a community to do. And so there's other incentivizations we could talk through, but a lot of what we're talking about, and with this rewrite, we're thinking through how zoning can play a role. And in this case, the way zoning can play a role is to help set these predetermined conditions to ensure that in the future, whether there's land use changes, whether the property has changed hands, whether someone is going to take on the development of one of these, for example, odd-shaped parcels that is in a crucial node of our urban environment, we've put these predetermined conditions in place that will only allow something to happen if it's serving what we want in that specific context.
And if I may add one point to this too, I think another example would be if a property abutted a right-of-way controlled by DOT or City of Atlanta that really lent itself to being a pocket park or an open space, you would want to make sure that the zoning code allows that developer to, with approval of the authority, to be able to credit that improvement towards open space so that they don't just leave it left behind and unthought about. So I think there are things like that where the zoning ordinance could align with this, but obviously, as Pavan mentioned, so much of it is about sort of the finer grain neighborhood conversations.
Yeah, just if I can just add one smaller thing even to that, a lot of what I realized through zoning that I don't think we talk enough about is I think because it sometimes sounds and feels very technical in terms of we just think about it controlling a height of a building, the size of a building, whether it's a house or a retail front. I think we kind of underestimate that we could also, it could spearhead, again, these community conversations and really talk about values as a community beyond just, again, thinking around the size of a building and, FAR, which are all technical terms. So a lot of what I'm hoping with, particularly my presentation and what I'm trying to spearhead today is hopefully encouraging people to think about values as a community and neighborhood.
Isn't this floating zone idea similar to the newly proposed civic center?
I'm personally not familiar with what's going on there.
How could a more vigorous and enforced tree ordinance dovetail with planning for use of residual spaces?
Yeah, so kind of similar, and this has actually been seen in current floating zones that exist in the country. Is sustainability and environmental uses are actually one of the predetermined values that have existed in other floating zones. For example, you could write in certain tree protections. You could potentially even define a species in conditions. You can define an age of a tree in potential values in terms of like if there is certain odd-shaped lots or certain spaces that could be developed, it could act as a, even like a specific layer of protection, or, even provide guidelines to, you can only provide, you can only have you can only create a house on this lot or a commercial space on this lot if you plant a certain number of trees of this native species. Like it can get extremely fine-grained as it needs to, or at least based off of other examples I've seen that have been successful.
Are there any questions from any of the viewing parties? Okay, we'll take the last question from Mr. Hepner. Go ahead, Mr. Hepner, with your second question.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. Have you considered or how might you reconcile the fact that changing the use of an existing property could be considered a taking and put basically undue hardship and amount to legal action?
But change wouldn't be done without going through the proper public process and legislative process.
Correct, but it would negate the value of an existing property. Like the residual space, it's public land. So what you're saying is that how you would direct what could be done on that is through zoning. So you would disallow current allowable uses that exist today. You would take those uses away and impose different restrictions on a piece of property that is currently owned by an individual. So you would be taking away the use of that property from that individual.
No, so the residual space would not, to activate the residual space, there will be text and code regulations associated with how that is activated. So that would be created, and then that will go through a public process. And then if there's a change in the request of that would also go through a public process. Okay, Caleb, that's all our questions.
Great. Well, good. I wanted to, I know we're almost out of time. I did want to ask folks to give us a little bit of a couple more minutes to react to this. So if we could go into the polling very quickly. The first question is, now that you've heard about this idea that we could have a zoning code that makes it easier to unlock residual space, is this something, how important is this to you that we look at doing this, or at least creating a mechanism that certain neighborhoods that were interested in this could have a code that could do that in the single family and low density residential areas? Is it important, somewhat important, unimportant, or very unimportant? I know this is certainly the kind of ideas that would only make sense, in my opinion, in some of the more urban parts of the city, but it's something that if it matters to you, we could look at creating a zoning code that enables it. So, in viewing parties, we're getting quite a few neutrals in the viewing parties. Some very important, some unimportants in the actual Zoom. Okay. I know this is a new concept, and some very importance in the viewing party. Okay, great. Related to that, same question, but do you think these ideas might be more applicable in the commercial and mixed use areas? Pavan showed an example of a Dollar Tree on, I believe it was Bolton Road or Marietta Road. And, that may be an easier case of where the zoning code could really develop better standards for what happens in those commercial areas. Do you think it may be more important for those areas? Okay. A lot more interest, it seems, in the commercial and mixed use. We'll give folks a couple more seconds to answer. Okay, good, good. And then the final question is related to all of this. So how important is it to you that the zoning code at least explore these ideas? And I'll talk a little bit more in about a minute about what we mean when we talk about explore as part of the next step of the rewrite process. But how important is it to have continued conversations on these ideas? Okay. Viewing party, we're getting a lot of very online. We're getting quite a few very as well. Somewhat important. Okay, great, great, great. We'll give you a few more seconds. And I wanted to take about 90 more seconds. And we're going to run over a little bit and talk to you about next steps, because this has really been, in my opinion, a fantastic series of idea labs. And I truly appreciate all of the thorough comments and the thoughtful questions that people have asked. But I wanted to share with you what we're going to do with this now, because we have talked about a lot and we've been working on the zoning ordinance a lot. Next slide, Yinka. So what we're planning on doing now, as you may remember, is generally speaking, working from very general, very conceptual to very specific over the course of actual several years, what it will take to actually rewrite the code. Next. And so right now we are in the process of wrapping up phase 2. And phase 2 of the process is about determining what are the type of changes that we're going to be making in the zoning code, so that we can come back to you with specific proposals and ideas to have further discussion about. Next. And so in the next couple of months, Lee, Director Holmes, Department of City Planning staff, and the whole team is going to be going through all of the feedback that we've received on the Idea Labs, both during the live sessions, but also online and through various emails. We're going to be reviewing the zoning ordinance diagnostic again, which we talked about at the beginning of the process. And we're going to come back to you early next year. We don't know exactly when yet, but early next year with a series of alternative workshops where we're all going to sit down and think if we can come up with specific proposals for your feedback on. And so these are going to be very detailed discussions with specific ideas for, hey, we want to change this in the zoning code, and this might be 3 options for how we could do it. What are your thoughts? And so we're going to do that for a variety of topics. We don't know exactly what they're going to be, but we're going to try to focus on the topics that we believe are of greatest interest to the public, to really focus those meaningful conversations. After that, next, Yinka, we are going to only then determine the preferred approach for actually rewriting the zoning ordinance. I know this process is taking a lot of time. I know it's going very slow for some of you and maybe very fast for others. But what we want to do is we want to then have a very specific idea with how we're going to structure the code and actually prepare a table of contents that shows where the various parts of the code are going to go, where current sections go, where we might focus effort on new section. And only after that process, early next year, where we've asked the questions, where we've gotten more direction, and we've got our marching orders for how we actually rewrite the code, only then are we going to actually begin the process of rewriting it. So again, early next year. Once that is done, there are going to be a series of other meetings. You may recall from my initial presentation, we have over 40 public meetings scheduled as part of this process. It's going to be very slow, but very deliberate. We're going to have a process that runs with enough time so that all of the stakeholders of Atlanta have an opportunity to consider the proposals, to provide feedback on the proposals before we proceed. We know that it's important to start with conceptual ideas, explore alternatives, and only after that has been done, begin the codification process. So I would ask you all to please continue to remain passionate about this process, continue to stay involved. If we could go to the next slide. The project website will be updated periodically as we move forward. But if you've signed in, we've got your email addresses. We will be working with our web team, with the Department of City Planning and the general outreach process of the city to let you know when we're going to have that again. So I'd like to thank you one more time for really sticking it out. I know this has been a long lab, but hopefully one of the more interesting ones. Remind you that the recording will be posted on the project website very shortly, probably tomorrow or the day after, atlzoning.com. That'll include a recording of the presentation today, and it will include a copy of the video. I know some of the actual slides. I know some of them may have been hard to read or see in the video format, so you'll be able to download them and read everything in more detail. So with that said, I'd like to thank you very much. I'd like to wish you a happy holiday season, and I look forward to working with everyone in the next early next year to move this process forward. Thank you very much.